there's something about the Marxist impulse towards action, social
Right.
action, that Gutierrez is taking into account and taking seriously.
Right.
That our theology cannot be abstract. It cannot just be a rational.
Well, it can't be merely abstract.
Merely abstract. Yeah.
It can't just be, as he says towards the conclusion of the first half, theology as a critical reflection on Christian praxis. See, theology as a critical reflection on Christian praxis is not bound by the contemporary context. It's not as if you may be influenced by it, but you're not limited to it, because the normative sources of the faith, those are going to be the standards by which you judge, the contemporary praxis of our society. So that's why he says theology is a critical reflection on Christian praxis in the light of the word, does not replace the other functions of theology, such as wisdom and rational knowledge.
Right. So
you have to integrate those two classical views that theology is the search for wisdom, and theology is faith-seeking understanding. Theology is going to be the disciplined exploration of the content of revelation. He's not a Schleiermachian. He doesn't think that the content of faith is generated by the contemporary context.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Equal Justice Podcast. My name is Anthony Costello. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. I am once again joined by my good friend, Dr. Ed Echeverria, who is a professor of philosophy and systematic theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit, Michigan. Beautiful Detroit, Michigan. Ed has earned his doctorate in philosophy from the Free University of Amsterdam and licentiate in sacred theology from the University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. Ed, were you actually in Rome when you did that?
No. The setup is that you do your work here in the States. It was actually through the seminary where I teach, and the degree is granted by the University of St. Thomas in Rome.
I see. Great. Well, Ed has published several books to include Berkouwer and Catholicism, Disputed Questions, Pope Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II, which I've read, Divine Election, A Catholic Orientation in Dogmatic and Ecumenical Perspectives, Oceans Deep, The Crucified God and Redemptive Suffering, and his most recent book, which I will show here and have also read, Revelation, History, and Truth, which I think is going to be relevant to our discussion today, especially. So Ed, thanks again for being with us today.
Always my pleasure. Always my pleasure.
It's always good to talk to you. And the topic that we had selected for today is liberation theology. Now, this is something that I know you're well informed on. You also are of it's Mexican roots, right, Ed?
Right. Instead of being in Florida last week, if the situation was as far as the COVID is concerned was good in Mérida, Yucatan, where I was born. It's right below, it's in the Gulf of Mexico. We would have been there because we try to go twice a year, but we haven't been since March of 2020. In fact, right after we came back from our March trip to Mérida, that's when everything sort of shut down.
Okay, so you guys still have family there?
I have plenty of family, relatives, etc.
And the reason that also to point that out is because, I think, we'll get into this, but liberation theology certainly, if it didn't have its roots, it certainly had a major impact in Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America,
right?
Especially, right? It was
right.
A number of Roman Catholic theologians and priests,
right,
sort of developed this.
But the interesting thing is that all of these theologians, like Gustavo Gutiérrez, that I'll say something about, and others, they all studied in Europe. They were all formed by European theologians.
Right. And probably German theologians
German
as
theologians,
well.
exactly.
Right.
Karl Rahner,
Yeah.
Johannes Baptist Metz, who died not too long ago.
Mm-hmm. Moltmann, perhaps, as well.
Because that was Bultmann was.
I'm sorry, Moltmann.
Moltmann, yeah, sure, Moltmann, definitely, Jürgen Moltmann, yeah.
So that's good. Well, okay, Ed, and let's just continue with that. So tell us a little bit. Just give us a few minute rundown of, where does liberation theology sort of, what its origins, some of its intellectual roots, and its major, let's say, major writers think.
One of its, we can actually begin with Karl Marx's in his theses on Feuerbach. In the 11th thesis, he says, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
Right.
The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change the world. So that means that, and like I said, I'll limit myself to talking about Gustavo Gutiérrez, who was he's still alive. He was a Peruvian theologian. He eventually became a Dominican priest some years later, but he wrote what is really the founding document of, at least not just for Catholics, but certainly for Catholicism, the founding document, A Theology of Liberation, which was actually published initially in Spanish, Teología de la Liberación, Perspectivas. It was published in 1971. So basically a half a century ago. It's been through several editions. And it was published by Orbis Press, Orbis Books in New York in 1973. And in the first chapter of the book, Gutiérrez looks at the nature of theology. And he distinguishes the classical tasks of theology, which he embraces, but wants to integrate into an understanding of theology as critical reflection on praxis. I'll say something about praxis in a moment, because praxis is not identical with, application or practice. Okay. There's a critical element, but we'll see. So theology is wisdom, of course. He says has to do with theology contributing to seeking a path of sanctity and seeking a life of spiritual perfection. And of course, that's always going to be done in the light of the normative, the authoritative sources of the faith. And he distinguishes that from theology as rational knowledge. So the sort of the classical view of theology, where theology is faith seeking understanding, or even in the case of Aquinas and others who thought that theology was a science.
Of Wissenschaft in German.
Wissenschaft, yes. Sense. But it was theology more in the sense of using Aristotelian categories. In Thomas in the Summa, in question 1 of the Summa, he distinguishes between all sciences are going to begin with certain first principles. Okay, but some sciences like theology, it begins with first principles that are derived from another source. They're derived from another source. So they're derived in the case of theology. Yes, it also begins with first principles, but those are not first principles that theology itself can justify. It's derived from another source, and so it's derived from Scripture. Right.
So the example, and we talked about this actually in our first interview.
Yeah.
It's reason but reason as derived from the sources of sacred scripture.
The sources of,
tradition.
so they're normative sources, scripture and tradition in some sense, of course. But so the classical view of theology tries to defend theology as a science. Now, theology is rational knowledge, you could say. So you have theology as wisdom, theology as rational knowledge. And although Gutierrez doesn't want to dismiss those aspects of theological inquiry, he integrates those two aspects into the notion that theology is critical reflection on praxis. So if you go back for a moment to that quote from Marx, that philosophy, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Critical reflection on praxis has that component. It begins historically, concretely, in this context, and it tries to understand the dynamics of this context. Again, the term praxis includes understanding the context and trying to be critical of it. Okay, so, but the norm for criticism, the fundamental norm for the critical science of theology is going to be the normative sources of the faith.
Right.
Gutierrez is not a relativist. Gutierrez is not he's not a liberal in the sense that he thinks that, if you remember the experiential expressivist category of George Lindbeck in his book, The Nature of Religion, the experiential expressivist thinks that you have an experience of God and then you formulate that experience in sentences and propositions and doctrines and all of that, but none of that is actually revealed. That's just human.
Sort of the Schleiermachian strain.
Exactly, that would be, but that's not
where we all have the universal experience of
numinous, and it's
divine,
formulated,
and then we formulate it out the best we can.
Right, exactly. So all of that.
So Gutierrez is still holding to revelation, knowledge, inspiration of the text of scripture.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
So he says in the section on theology as critical reflection on praxis, he says the function of theology as critical reflection on praxis has gradually become more clearly defined in recent years, but he thinks that it has its roots in the first centuries of the church. He says the Augustinian theology of history, which we find in the City of God, for example, is based on a true analysis of the signs of the times and the demands with which they challenge the Christian community. So the notion, the signs of the times, theology is going to have to be attentive. What is it that the culture, what are the signs of the times? What is it that the culture is demanding of us as Christians, as Christian intellectuals, as theologians? How is it challenging the Christian community, he says?
So like theology actualized. I feel like Marx was like, hey, we have to actualize our philosophy.
Right, but the actualization involves a critical element of changing. Critical. It's critical reflection on praxis, and it involves then. Remember, Marx says the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
Right.
So to be engaged theologically for Gutierrez is to be engaged in the transformation of the culture.
Not just the individual.
No, not just the individual. No, the culture.
The institutions that and culture that the individual participates in and lives in.
So, for instance, he says in that first chapter, what since John the 23rd and Vatican Council II began to be called the theology of the signs of the times. So in Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, it says that you have to understand the signs of the times. What's going on in the culture?
That's the aggiornamento.
Aggiornamento, right? Exactly. But you have to do that in the light of the gospel. In the light of the gospel. It must not be forgotten that the signs of the times are not only a call to intellectual analysis, he says, they are above all a call to pastoral activity, to commitment, and to service. Studying the signs of the times includes both dimensions, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 44, points out that discerning the signs of the times is the responsibility of every Christian, especially pastors and theologians, to hear, distinguish, and interpret the many voices of our age, and to judge them in the light of the divine word. In this way, revealed truths can always be more deeply penetrated, better understood, and set forth to greater advantage, he says. So, he goes on to talk about how philosophical reflection also reinforces the importance of human action as the point of departure for all reflection. It's the point of departure, the context, praxis is the point of departure, but it's not the norm. It's not what's going to, it's not the norm governing critical theological reflection. Because if that were the case, then that would make him a relativist.
Just a social theorist, right? Where there's nothing outside of society that from which we can draw to actually make the critique of society, kind of.
Now, he says, to these factors can be added the influence of Marxist thought, focusing on praxis and geared to the transformation of the world. The Marxist influence began to be felt in the middle of the 19th century. But in recent times, its cultural impact has become greater. Many agree with Sartre, quote, that Marxism, as the formal framework of all contemporary philosophical thought, cannot be superseded. Sartre eventually became a communist, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
Be that as it may, contemporary theology does in fact find itself in direct and fruitful confrontation with Marxism, and it is to a large extent due to Marxism's influence that theological thought, searching for its own sources, has begun to reflect on the meaning of the transformation of this world and the action of man in history.
Okay, that's very interesting, because obviously what is permeating through our airwaves and our social media waves is sort of a coupling, or a concern about things like cultural Marxism. Now, these are broad terms, right?
Right. These people I don't think, even though for instance, I've watched, I don't know if you ever watched Steve Hilton.
Not familiar with him, no.
The Next Revolution.
Okay.
He's on Sunday nights on Fox Cable.
Okay.
And he gave a couple of weeks ago, he gave some talks about trying to get at the roots of, identity politics and the BLM movements and so on. And he traces it back to, he thinks, yes, it's Marxism, and he traces it back to critical theory. And critical theory here refers specifically to a group of the Frankfurter Schule, the Frankfurter School.
Frankfurt School.
Yeah, referring to Horkheimer and
Adorno
and even some sort of, they all belong to a certain institute before the rise of Nazism, and many of them left. They came to the United States.
Right.
Adorno and Horkheimer.
Marcuse was probably maybe
Marcuse
the most
went
impactful.
to California, but very different. But Marcuse also, I mean, his book, One Dimensional Man, there are many good things in that book. One Dimensional Man, he wrote a book also on psychoanalysis and Marxism.
Eros and Civilization, I believe.
Eros and Civilization. And that basically had to do with the fact that these neo-Marxists, as they came to be called, understood that the dynamics of history were not merely economic.
Yeah.
It wasn't really about the economy. And they understood that, Marx didn't figure on, unions, bargaining, so they Eros and Civilization, Marcuse, to put it very briefly and superficially, Marcuse, the dynamic of history became the transformation, if you will, of the individual.
Right.
because psychoanalysis was about, remember, in Freud.
Radical subjectivity, I think he talks
Right,
about.
right. But I think the crucial thing is in someone like Freud is where, Freud says where id is, ego will be. So, in other words, id is going to be those things, those quasi-causal forces outside the individual that, causally influence the individual to do a certain thing. Freud thought that if you sat down to talk to someone so that you could discover those forces within him that were causal-like, and affected, events in your past life. And so you're trying to discover these past events that have, in a quasi-causal sense, urged you to act a certain way, so that when you bring them to consciousness, where id was, ego will be. You will be then, to be ego, you will be autonomous in that sense. You will be free of those.
It's liberation. It's a liberation from
exactly. So
your alienation from your true self.
Right. So someone like Marcuse, again, to put it briefly and superficially, he's trying to insert psychoanalysis into the dynamics of human discovery, human authenticity, so that, and to do that, of course, you have to also change the culture. Even, look, Black Lives Matter, if you go to the Black Lives Matter website, they want to dismantle the family, the traditional family.
I think they've taken it down at this point, but we know that the intent is still the same.
Right. Do away with the traditional family.
Which was a huge part of Marcuse's treatise, right? I mean, that was for Marcuse one of the fundamental institutions that had to be undone, was monogamous lifelong marriage in the Christian sense.
Certainly in the Christian sense.
Yeah.
And then also things like, the whole business about doing away with the difference between male and female, because BLM is a supporter of transgenderism, homosexuality, reproductive rights, abortion.
Those are all just things that the heteronormativity,
all of that stuff.
Yeah, right. Has
so I don't know. I don't think that. Look, I don't think that you could align someone like Gutierrez with all that.
Right.
No more than, in my view, no more than you could align Martin Luther King with all that.
Right.
Because Martin Luther King took as his normative point of reference the Declaration of Independence. Or even, remember that adage of his, that you judge a man not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. That's denied now. So,
let me ask this then about Gutierrez, because so there's something about the Marxist impulse towards action, social action, that Gutierrez is taking into account and taking seriously.
Right.
That our theology cannot be abstract. It cannot just be a rational.
Well, it can't be merely abstract.
Merely abstract. Yeah.
It can't just be, as he says towards the conclusion of the first half, theology as a critical reflection on Christian praxis. See, theology as a critical reflection on Christian praxis is not bound by the contemporary context. It's not as if you may be influenced by it, but you're not limited to it, because the normative sources of the faith, those are going to be the standards by which you judge, the contemporary praxis of our society. So that's why he says theology is critical reflection on Christian praxis in the light of the word, does not replace the other functions of theology, such as wisdom and rational knowledge.
Right. So you
have to integrate those two classical views that theology is the search for wisdom, and theology is faith-seeking understanding. Theology is going to be the disciplined exploration of the content of revelation. he's not a Schleiermachian. He doesn't think
Right.
that the content of faith is generated by the contemporary context.
Right, right, exactly. Which is then the, if you're talking about the aggiornamento
Right.
of Vatican II, which is the, hey, contextualize for the culture of the day.
Right, but it's not. I always quote Oscar
it.
Kuhlman there.
Yeah.
I always quote Oscar Kuhlman there because Oscar Kuhlman said that aggiornamento is not an isolated motive for renewal. It's not as if, I used to hate it when I would get these, in the 70s and 80s, you'd get these pamphlets from local bishops, Episcopal bishops conferences, and they would say something like, updating, as if somehow, aggiornamento meant is an isolated motive for renewal. Like we have to catch up with the times, you see.
Right, which would be neglecting the other side of Vatican II, which was the ressourcement, right?
That's right, ressourcement. So going back to the sources,
yeah.
But even aggiornamento doesn't come first. Ressourcement has prior. I like to quote here. What's his name? Let's see if I have it with me. I like to quote here Kevin Van Hooser, who talks about ressourcement in his book on, the book that he wrote.
Babel, After Babel? Is it the After Babel book?
No, it's not After Babel, but it's a book that he wrote before, around 2017, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And he talks about ressourcement. He talks about retrieval theology.
Yep. Retrieval.
And retrieval theology is, going back to the sources of the faith so that you can move faithfully forward.
Right.
You can move faithfully forward by attending. You have to attend to the questions that are raised, you see. Now.
And that's Gutierrez. So Gutierrez is firmly in that line of thinking.
Right, but he went through a period. He went through a certain time of criticism. I mean, so you remember I sent you those two. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in '84 came out with an instruction on certain aspects. That's the first. It came out with two instructions, '84 and '86. Instruction on certain aspects of the theology of liberation. And although it doesn't mention Gutierrez here, it's discussing theologies of liberation. See, because there's a plural. There isn't just one theology. There's even a Catholic theology of liberation.
Sure.
It's not necessarily how Gutierrez conceived of it. Because, of course, given the influence of Marxism, there is a sense in which the class struggle assumes...
It gets caught up in the just in the economic sphere. Maybe.
Just the economic, the social aspect. Let's see if we can...
Which, of course, is not unimportant. We're not saying...
No, it's not. No, of course not. Of course not.
Especially...
But also there's a distinction that's drawn between redemption and liberation.
Okay,
you see, they don't want to reduce the gospel to a purely this-worldly...
A materialistic gospel.
A gospel that's only about this life.
Yeah.
A gospel that's not about redemption, about... God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting men's sins against them.
To the loss of the transcendent, and metaphysical reality.
Yes,
that
all of that,
the creeds.
but also the loss of a real understanding of the gospel. I'm trying to find this. Anyway.
Sounds like, Charles Taylor in A Secular Age talks about Francis of Assisi.
Right.
Like how one views Francis of Assisi's life.
Right.
Will tell you a lot about your theology, because if you think Francis of Assisi was just crazy, or what he did was meaningless, then you may have lost the understanding of the spiritual.
Right. Exactly. Well, here, the beginning of this instruction, the gospel of Jesus Christ is a message of freedom and a force for liberation. In recent years, this essential truth has become the object of reflection for theologians, with a new kind of attention which is itself full of promise. Liberation is first and foremost liberation from the radical slavery of sin.
This is in the Catechism?
No, this is in the instruction on certain aspects of the theology of liberation. This
From
is
the
a
Congregation of the Doctrine.
that's right. Its end and its goal is the freedom of the children of God, which is a gift of grace. As a logical consequence, it calls for freedom from many different kinds of slavery in the cultural, economic, social, and political sphere, all of which derive ultimately from sin. Later on, it also goes on to reject the idea that everything is just structural sin.
Mm-hmm.
Structure, that all you have to do is change the structures of society, as if ultimately the root of structural sin is not the sin of men.
Which is very like Rousseauian, right? I mean, it's more
right,
like
exactly.
Way of like man, is born free from
right, and then these structures
everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. To discern clearly what is fundamental to this issue and what is a byproduct of it is an indispensable condition for any theological reflection on liberation. Faced with the urgency of certain problems, it said, some are tempted to emphasize unilaterally the liberation from servitude of an earthly and temporal kind. They do it in such a way that they seem to put liberation from sin in second place, and so fail to give it the primary importance it is due. Thus, their very presentation of problems is confused and ambiguous. Mm. Others, in an effort to learn more precisely what are the causes of the slavery which they want to end, make use of different concepts without sufficient critical caution. It is difficult and perhaps impossible to purify these borrowed concepts of an ideological inspiration which is compatible with Christian faith and the ethical requirements which flow from it. And then just one last passage. The present instruction has a much more limited and precise purpose: to draw the attention of pastors, theologians, and all the faithful to the deviations and risks of deviation damaging to the faith and to Christian living that are brought about by certain forms of liberation theology, which use, in an insufficiently critical manner, concepts borrowed from various currents of Marxist thought.
I read a book by Alistair McIntyre. I think he wrote it while Marxism and Christianity, right? Yeah. And I think he wrote it while he was still, a socialist. He was not yet converted to Catholicism.
Right, it's true.
And it's incredible. I mean, I want to say, like, one of the reasons why Marxism keeps rearing its ugly head is because while it's not compatible, there's tremendous similarities, right? And maybe we have to make a distinction between similarity and compatibility.
Right. Well, there are certainly themes.
Yeah, that are
themes
that resonate deeply.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Just the mere fact. I mean, again, if we go back to Marx's, the philosophers only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So there's just this concern to change the world, and they want theology. Theology is I remember Nick Wolterstorff in his little book. The second edition had another addition to it, but praxis-oriented theory. Praxis-oriented theory is not that you're applying the Christian faith. No. Praxis-oriented theory means, as Gutierrez says, it's critical reflection on praxis in the light of the normative sources of the faith, you see. And praxis, as I said, is, yes, it does incorporate the element of the historical social context, but praxis also has an intellectual element because you're engaged in reflecting on the situation. And of course, you're not trapped. You're not trapped in that context. You're not trapped in that context. You have the normative sources, right? You're not trapped. And critique, and you have you can make critical judgments,
right?
And so there are standards.
Now there does seem to be, and I think maybe this is what we're really bumping up against hard in the culture right now. So this is good, because one of the things that I've seen is some maybe people trying to make tentative connections between liberation theology and something like critical race theory. But I think what we're showing is at least someone like Gutierrez is very different from a sort of contemporary critical race theorist who does not have any authoritative normative sources outside of just whatever society itself says is real.
Well, it says everything is race. Everything has to be seen
Or for
through
them,
race.
everything's
Remember,
race. It could be a
remember, it has this
feminist.
social determinism of race. The mere
Yeah.
fact that you're white makes you an oppressor, and the mere fact that a person is black makes him oppressed.
Yeah.
So now there are aspects of Gutierrez also that are troubling, in the sense that he thinks that development, the context in which he's reflecting, you see, that development was the fruit of capitalism. So there's going to be a critique of capitalism there.
Capitalism, colonialism.
Colonialism, exactly. All of that is part of it. But of course, Gutierrez has, again, he's a Christian, and he has these normative sources of the faith. And so, man is created in the image of God. He has human dignity. He wants to also get away from the idea, in the later chapters, he wants to also get away from the idea that you can, in fact, it's that paragraph from Gaudium et Spes 43, which he wants to get away from this kind of dualistic conception of faith and life and faith and culture, that he wants to get away from the privatization of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
If you remember Father Richard John, well, before he was a Catholic priest, his book, what is it? The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America.
Mm-hmm.
So there are aspects of that book. Well, at the core of that book is the idea that there is no naked public square, that you can't, the idea of the privatization of Christianity. You can find Gutierrez was influenced, I think, as other liberation theologians, was influenced by Jacques Maritain.
Mm-hmm.
His book Integral Humanism, because it's the difference between the old Christendom, which is the Christendom of an ecclesiastically unified culture,
right,
and the new Christendom, which is the sanctified laity engaged and involved in the transformation of culture for the sake of Christ. Through
other mechanisms of culture, right? Like,
well,
we're talking about politics and
well, not just politics. I mean, the culture, the full spectrum of culture. You have to,
everything.
If you Lumen Gentium in chapter 4, chapter 5, you have the calling of the laity to be involved in the transformation of the culture for the sake of Christ. The call to holiness, which is not just for. It's not only the religious and priests who are called to holiness. Holiness is a universal calling. So I think the theology of liberation, Gutierrez in particular, they learned from the Vatican II. They learned from people like Jacques Maritain, because Maritain is critical of this dualism, for instance, between faith and culture. In fact, the very dualism that you can find represented by people like, the president of, the United States.
Okay, who is currently, well, so it's said, at least, a Roman Catholic.
Right.
I think the first, at least professed with his mouth, Roman Catholic since Kennedy, right?
Yeah. But in the light of Kennedy didn't draw attention to that as such, although he also there's a continuity between Kennedy and someone like Biden, because there's also that dualism between faith and life, between faith and culture. There's a reduction of Christianity to a social gospel.
Okay, let me because I just started reading Niebuhr's Moral Man in a Moral Society.
Right.
And the foreword is actually by Cornell West, who I don't know much about, but and he talks about Niebuhr's criticism of liberal theology.
Right.
Liberal theology meaning sort of like this social gospel of we are going to bring the kingdom of God here through our social efforts, activism, and projects. And of course, Niebuhr says that is like I don't know what he would say. I haven't read, but like maybe a Pollyannish idea, because sin is just
right.
too radical, right? We'll never this liberal dream, especially then, of course, it starts to fade out a little bit after the atrocities of World War II.
Right.
But how does the liberation theologies of a Gutierrez, how do they differ then from some of these liberal Protestant social gospels?
Well, I think part of it is that in the first place, Gutierrez certainly doesn't reduce the gospel to a social gospel. It's not just about it's yes, you have
just about changing the condition.
Yeah, you can find remember, so it's theologies of liberation,
mm-hmm.
and you can find them dealing with class struggle, class conflict, and so on, being a major dynamic in development, you see. And so of course that's where the conflict between capitalism and socialism,
mm-hmm.
The place of the state and all that. But let me read you this passage from Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 43. It says, "This council exhorts Christians as citizens of two cities to strive to discharge their earthly duties conscientiously and in response to the gospel spirit. They are mistaken who, knowing that we have here no abiding city, but seek one which is to come, think that they may therefore shirk their earthly responsibility. For they are forgetting that by the faith itself they are more than ever obliged to measure up to these duties, each according to his proper vocation. Nor, on the contrary," so that on the one hand, "on the contrary, are they any less wide of the mark who think that religion consists in acts of worship alone, and in the discharge of certain moral obligations, and who imagine they can plunge themselves into earthly affairs in such a way as to imply that these are altogether divorced from the religious life. This split between the faith which many profess in their daily lives deserves to be counted among the more pernicious errors of our age," it says. "Therefore, let there be no false opposition between professional and social activities on the one part, and religious life on the other," and so on. So the point is that it seems to me you have, yes, Biden, he's a devout Catholic. I have no idea what that means. Because the fact is he's a liberal. His version of Christianity is a liberal Christianity because he reduces the gospel to a social gospel. Right. He reduces the gospel to a social gospel. And also, on the other hand, he has he thinks that, for instance, he may tell you that, and I don't believe it, but he may tell you that he supports, that life begins at conception and all of that. But the fact is, it seems to me it's one thing to say, okay, I'm a politician. The United States has legalized the practice of abortion. So that's the law. But within the boundaries of the law, I'm going to try to do whatever I can to put certain restrictions around the practice of abortion. As to who can, are there no conditions that you would put under the practice of abortion? I mean, is it he doesn't merely tolerate the practice of abortion. He promotes it.
Yeah, right. Well, let me, because I'll reference another interview that I did with Father Wilson Miscampbell, who was the,
Oh yeah, from Notre Dame.
Bill Miscampbell. He's a friend of my family's, and
Right. I don't know him personally, but I know of him. Yeah.
We were talking about his book on Father Ted Hesburgh,
Right.
There was an event where Mario Cuomo, who's still governor of New York at the time, came to Notre Dame to speak.
Right.
And he sort of gave this, what became called the Cuomo rule. I'm personally
opposed,
against, but Father Ted, who was not outspoken on the life issues, because he was always walking this line with his very sort of politically liberal friends and stuff. But he did respond to Cuomo after that speech, saying that, but as a Catholic, it's your job to work within the political domain to build a consensus that changes the views and opinions on abortion.
Right.
And Biden will never do that. I mean,
No, and that's particularly because the question is, the question of abortion is the question of who belongs to the human family. What is the origin of human rights? It's not as such a religious question. The humanity of the unborn can be established through embryology, fetology, genetics, and so on. It seems to me and the morality of the practice of abortion. It just seems to me that people like Biden, President Biden, they've either never thought about this,
or they just don't have the will.
They don't have the will to think about it. No, they don't. They don't have the will to do it. And it's so extreme now.
Gutierrez would be somebody who would, in his because he would certainly be a pro-life figure.
Well, yeah, of course.
Spokesman.
Now, he may be
liberation.
He may have one of these
seamless garment.
Yeah, seamless garment. But even the seamless garments, never wanted to say. It was. I would say that it's rife with potential for misinterpretation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you think, like Bishop McClory out of San Diego, who said that legislating against abortion is a prudential judgment, that in fact providing certain boundaries, restrictions. Look, the point is that it seems to me, if a person, if you're a Catholic and you're doing everything within your power to render the practice of abortion unrestricted, unconditional, you're hiring, all these people that he's nominated for positions in the government. I don't see how one can say in any genuine sense, like the Biden's press secretary said when she was asked about this. Well, let's not forget that the president began his term of office by going to mass, and he's a devout Catholic. I don't think that means anything.
Yeah.
I don't think that means anything. And I think, as I said, it fits into this idea that somehow there's a split between the faith, which is professed, and daily life, the full spectrum of culture.
Right.
They don't understand that abortion is the question about who belongs to the human family.
Right.
Human rights.
Yeah.
How do you, the humanity of the unborn and so on. And, they'll throw out these silly rhetorical phrases. Anyway, it just seems to me.
I mean, it is one of the concrete moral issues that I think highlights.
Right.
Because, again, there's, going back to like Black Lives Matter, there's sort of like a, incongruency here. We're saying there one emphasis on the racial group Black,
Right.
But then almost no concern, or even working in the opposite direction for the category unborn Black babies.
Well, that's the other
right.
Yes, of course. Right.
And this is where, like, I mean, it may be like a liberation. This is where you would think like a liberation message could that putting faith into praxis, well, critical reflection, but also some kind of action, so that you have a fully orbed way to address your cultural context.
Right.
So it's reminding me almost of like Kierkegaard's criticism of the Christianity he saw in Denmark in the 19th century.
Right.
Where this is just a facade, of culture, but it's empty.
In my view, Biden's Catholicism is a facade.
Yeah.
He may think that it's when he says he's a devout Catholic and all that, but it's clear to me that he hasn't really thought about it, and his Christianity is a liberal Christianity, so that it leaves you with, yes, emphasizing things like climate change and immigration. But even immigration, I mean, I think we wouldn't be today where we are at the borders if he hadn't lifted Trump's border policies, because all he's doing now is trying to create the capacity for all these people and young people that are coming over, but not trying to provide a secure border. There's no security.
Right.
There's no security.
Let's stay on that a little bit, in the sense of like, so I mean, Gutierrez is writing, thinking, ministering was in Mexico, right? In his day.
No, he was in Peru.
He was in Peru. Okay.
He was a Peruvian.
Okay. But this is one of those issues of where, how, if at all, how did these, let's say, I mean, so we're I think you're making the point that at least Gutierrez' version of liberation theology is biblically faithful.
There are aspects of it that I think are more compatible with traditional Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, because he went through also changes.
Yes, in his own.
He was criticized in this document and in the subsequent one. He had conversations with what's his name, with Ratzinger and understood, accepted some of the criticisms. What is the place of Marx, and also political violence.
Yeah.
And also the this worldly gospel that was
devoid of,
as you said, of the transcendent, devoid of the sense of sin. So it's not that Gutierrez was wasn't that his views didn't need to be criticized at certain points, but I would say that out of all the other theologians of liberation or liberation theology, Gutierrez was the one that was most compatible, I would say, with Orthodox Christianity.
Now, speaking as a native Mexican yourself, then, I mean,
but I don't like to talk about that, because I didn't spend any time in Mexico. I was born there.
Oh, okay. You came.
And we immigrated legally, I always say.
All
to
right.
the
Well,
United
then,
States
I don't know if you say
2 years old.
observations going back to visit your relatives. I mean, I'm just talking about impact in Mexico, Central America, of the.
Well, I think
theologies like this, positive, negative. It came.
Well, look, I think the Catholic Church in Latin America was not, at one point, was not open to liberation theology, because, of course, it's critical reflection on praxis and trying to change the society. And so if Catholicism is virtually indistinguishable from the society, you know, then it becomes very difficult, you know, and you have, you know, capitalism and all of that. It makes it very difficult then to be open to this kind of understanding of theology that's going to change the society, you want to change the church, and all of that. But you know, I think someone like Gutierrez, you know, there are all kinds of things that I mean, he distinguishes between salvation and liberation. The work of Christ, he says, is a new creation. In this sense, Paul speaks of a new creation in Christ. Moreover, it is through this new creation, that is to say, through the salvation which Christ affords, that creation acquires its full meaning. But the work of Christ is presented simultaneously as a liberation from sin and from all its consequence, despoliation, injustice, hatred, and all of that. So you have all of these aspects built into his conception of a theology of liberation. You know, the rejection of a dualism between nature and grace. You know, grace transforms nature from within, which again I think he learns from what's his name, Jacques Maritain, and he there's an integration there of you know, what can we learn from Marx? Now, of course, and social democratic conceptions, you know, that European conceptions of democracy that are social democracy, that's all part of the picture, it seems to me. But I've always thought that Gutierrez was someone then who you could have a conversation with. In fact, Gutierrez, The Power of the Poor in History. This was a book that Gutierrez co-wrote a few years ago with Gerhard Müller, Cardinal Müller, who was the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for several years, and he co-wrote this book, and I remember one of the chapters of Müller, where Müller locates the theology of liberation with respect to the Nouvelle Theologie of de Lubac and Congar and others, precisely because of this nature and grace, where grace is about transforming nature from within, as opposed to having these two separate tracks. You know, when you were talking earlier, I was thinking about Niebuhr. I was thinking about you know, Reinhold's brother H. Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture. And the one of the types, there's a typology there, and one of the types is the Christ of culture, where Christ and culture are virtually indistinguishable from each other. And so, you know, the liberal Christian, his position becomes virtually indistinguishable from the culture.
Right.
And so you're giving people less and less you're giving them less and less of things to disbelieve. It's this worldly, Niebuhr says, and all of that. So, and then there's the Christ, you know, the Christ against culture, which of course, you know, there's an oppositional relationship there.
Right.
And then there's the Christ, the perfecter of culture, and Christ, the transformer of culture. So you have aspects of that in the theology of liberation, that Christ is the transformer of culture.
Transformer of culture, which is obviously something I think we embrace, right?
Yeah,
clearly. and within the
And even Christ against
confines
culture.
of, again, within the confines again of Revelation, in the inspired.
Right, right,
Of course, I know for
right, right,
sacred tradition for the Roman Catholic as well would be included in that structure of authority, as well as
right.
the teaching magisterium. So let's finish up then with talking about
Okay.
maybe the more what could be that more problematic liberal theology, not liberation theology per se, at least not in the Gutierrez sense,
No, no, right,
where sort of the metaphysics of our Christian faith is dumped in
right.
favor of what might maybe Charles Taylor might call a totally immanent frame.
Right.
And by the way, on Charles Taylor, you mentioned Jamie Smith last time in our conversation. I was like, Jamie Smith, but I only knew him as James K.A. Smith. So
Oh,
that's
I see.
why
Yeah, no, Jamie's.
like who you. But so I read the 2 short books by him, and then I went ahead and just grabbed A Secular Age. So
Right,
I find a lot of Taylor's terms very useful. Obviously, I think many.
right.
Okay, but the liberal theology, social gospel of liberal Protestantism that Niebuhr, Reinhold had criticized.
Right.
That
Remember that quote from what's his name, from his brother, from H. Richard, from his book The Kingdom of God in America. Liberal theology, the core of liberal theology was a God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross.
Right.
That's the core of liberal theology. And in their own fashion, I mean, Niebuhr in his Gifford lectures on the nature and destiny of man, he tries to do justice. He's not in that sense. I mean, he's what do you call him? People call him a neoliberal, a neo-orthodox, all of that.
Yeah.
But he's not an experiential expressivist, I don't think. And he has a place for sin and redemption and the cross and all of those things, just like his brother did.
Yeah. I mean, he's not
orthodox.
Orthodox as we would be on things like an actual historical fall.
No.
Stuff like that. But okay, let me frame this next section. Like, so, and I'll just reference this, but I heard recently that Kendi, Ibrahim Kendi, had held a talk or a speech or something that he gave where he was trying to make a distinction between savior theology and what was the other? What was he pitting that up against? It wasn't maybe, I don't know, savior theology and critical or liberal theology or something, where it seemed pretty clear that it seemed what he was trying to get at maybe was something like, a totally imminent,
right,
Christian religious impulse,
right,
man transforming himself in virtue of transforming his structures, Rousseauian, very Rousseauian. And Carl Trueman's new book, which I'll reference again, this one, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, does a good job of sort of tracing the intellectual heritage of through the Romantics and everything to where there's clearly a message that goes back several hundred years now that is absolutely an anti-Orthodox Christian message.
Right.
Packaged and repackaged in so many forms.
Right.
Oftentimes finding itself in the realm of art, especially.
Right.
But it's always been there. It's been there for a long time, at least. And of course, we could trace it back even further, I'm sure. But you've written your latest book, or your most recent one, I think, Revelation, History, and Truth.
Yeah.
Which attacks this, I guess what we'd call like this idea of historicism.
Right.
Right. Where there is nothing objective universal.
Right.
Beyond which the society can point to adjudicate over anything that any given society says.
Right.
So, I mean, tell us a little bit about how you present the case for an objective faith. with
Right.
real metaphysical content that is knowable,
Right.
which is very antithetical to, I think, what these social theorists of today are trying to foist upon us.
Right. Well, look, my book there, Revelation, History, and Truth, I'm trying to do several things. One of the things I'm trying to do is to show that, for instance, to understand, let's say, the Nicene Creed, we have to understand that it's in its historical context. So we need to understand even concepts like nature and person and so on. Nicene Creed, Chalcedon. We have to have a historical understanding of those things, but of what is asserted there. Mm-hmm. But what is asserted is enduringly valid, you see. So I want to make a distinction between understanding the historical context in which these things were initially asserted and then dealing with the truth content of what is asserted. Right. In other words, I'm trying to defend propositional truth. Propositional truth, meaning thereby, propositions, you make certain assertions. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And if those assertions are true, they're true because what is asserted there is in fact the case about objective reality. So the Nicene Creed can only be defended, it seems to me, if you have a realist view of truth, if you have a propositional view of truth, if you have a propositional view of revelation, because that's also part of my argument. That's why in the second chapter, The Nature of Revelation, I start off by discussing, from the early 20th century, why, listing a whole range of theologians who in fact rejected propositional revelation and embraced the idea that the content of revelation, in fact, there is no content to revelation, that the content of faith is simply the product of human reflection on having experienced God. So I go on to argue against some theologians in that chapter, like the second chapter, The Nature of Revelation. I go on to argue, that revelation is propositional, that propositional truth is necessary. I also go on to argue in the second part of that chapter, I engage Kevin Van Hooser in a conversation about the relationship between scripture, tradition, and ecclesial authority.
Right.
All of that, it seems to me, is
which is a little bit more of our in-house
right.
debate. Then
the first chapter, I discuss essentialism versus historicism, right, regarding the truth status of doctrinal formulations. Yeah. So right. There too, I'm trying to again defend that you need a metaphysics in order to, as it were, to hook, so that you can hook your propositional claims. But you have to distinguish between the propositional truths of faith and their formulations. The formulations can change, but the propositions remain the same. They're enduringly valid. And then, of course, you have to ask the question, this is where I discuss Vincent of Lorenz, and
right?
All of that, and the different interpretations of the Second Vatican Council. I also have a chapter, Revelation and Foundationalism. That you can't, people, some of the thinkers there that I discuss, try to be realists, but then they want a non-foundationalist view of epistemology. But I don't think you can have. I think you have to have some foundationalist view, because if you're claiming that what you're asserting here is in fact the case about objective reality, which is what the realist claims, mm-hmm. then of course there has to be certain foundations to your faith, to your theological system. Knowledge. It can't even, and then I discuss critical, people who are critical realists. And then throughout the book, there's also this whole business about doctrinal developments. Mm-hmm. And so I have a chapter discussing, Berkhauer's, his critique the understanding of faith and reason, as he saw it, the classical Catholic view, and then the view of the Nouvelle Theologie, which tried to give us a different view of that relationship. And I try to show that it's like, for instance, just to put it this way, it's like when people say, you have even Catholics who say this, the Second Vatican Councils had a declaration on religious liberty. And there are some Catholics who think that religious liberty is incompatible with the Lordship of Christ. So one of the bishops, French bishops, Lefebvre, who was actually then excommunicated, said one of his books was entitled Christ Uncrowned, Christ Dethroned. And so he thought that there was an incompatibility between affirming religious liberty and the Lordship of Christ. He thought that there was a contradiction between Pius XI's encyclical Mortalium Animus, where Pius rejects religious liberty, and the Declaration on Religious Liberty, and many other things. So you have to try to show that there's a continuity there, that there's a doctrinal development, but there's an underlying continuity. Yeah. Everything that Pius rejected, or everything that Gregory the 16th rejected about religious liberty, or Leo rejected, the church still rejects. But the church went on to ask, well, what's the nature of religious liberty? How can we integrate religious liberty with the notion of the Lordship of Christ? The two are not incompatible. It's the same thing, questions about ecclesiology. And so I try to deal with that by providing an argument that shows that there can be continuity, there can even be reversals with respect to certain teachings that were never infallibly
proclaimed.
Infallible. For a teaching to be infallible, that means that it has the highest degree of certainty.
Right.
The church doesn't make anything true. When the church teaches infallibly, that means that it's ascribing to a proposition that it knows to be true the highest degree of certainty.
I think what's important to point out here, I mean, you gave us sort of a brief overview there of, I mean, a sort of a Christian epistemology, I think, that would broadly apply to Protestants, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox.
Right.
Went in a little bit more detail on maybe the Roman Catholic structure of authority. Right. But what I think is important also to point out for our audience is, when we hear popular or even academic level critical race theorists, there's an undercutting move here that they're making, which is to say that so much of these epistemic positions, foundationalism, realism about metaphysics, claims that propositional truths can be universal and binding upon all people at all times.
They're all relativists.
They just say that these themselves are constructs of, maybe they'll say, the critical race theorists.
Well, the constructs of race and so on. Yeah. See, I often say to people, look, Aristotle formulated the laws of logic. That doesn't mean that the laws of logic, which are enduringly valid, that doesn't mean that the laws of logic are Greek laws, or that they're Aristotle's laws.
Right.
No more than the law of gravity, which was discovered by Isaac Newton, is a British law. So all of these views, it seems to me, from these critical race theorist people, it seems to me that they commit the fallacy of ad hominem arguments. They're all relativists. They don't know how to distinguish between what is asserted.
Right. Well, and then of course everything they say is viciously circular.
Yeah. Well, then so is critical race theory. But for me, the core of problem with critical race theory is what I've called elsewhere, this social determinism of race. That you're not a racist because of what you do,
right?
But you're a racist because of who you are. you're a white man, that makes you a racist, that makes you an oppressor.
Yep.
Even if you have never committed acts of racism. So for me, again, the fundamental thing is that the vision of Martin Luther King was inspired by the proposition that all men are created equal. The self-evident truth, as the Declaration says, that all men are created equal. Martin Luther King, in his day, he wasn't into Black power,
right,
identity politics, all of that. It seems to me, you judge a man not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
And that, which is not to say that in history, people who have come from the same culture or looked the same haven't banded together in order to do great evil.
Well, of course, but that's
obvious.
That's why you have, that's why Martin Luther King called the assertion that we hold these truths to be self-evident a promissory note.
That had not been realized yet.
It had to be cashed. It had to be realized.
Right.
And it was, Lincoln brought about a further realization of that truth with the Emancipation Proclamation, with the amendment that freed the slaves in the end, and then the Civil Rights Bill.
Yeah.
It's as if you listen to Black Lives Matter, if you listen to critical race theory, it's as if nothing has been done.
Yeah. Well, and this is because I think this is in part, and I have an article on this forthcoming in Journal for Christian Legal Thought. Again, if logic itself is downstream from your social group or culture, well then, we're purely in the realm of the will and willingness.
Escape from reason, man, to quote the title of Schaeffer's book.
Very Nietzsche.
Escape from reason.
Yeah.
We've escaped from reason. We've escaped from argument.
Yeah.
It's
purely in the realm of the will. And then,
purely in the realm. It's pure, in that sense, pure Nietzscheanism.
Yeah.
And it's cultural relativism. Can't make distinctions between assertions.
You even have the aspect of resentment, resentment theory, there.
Right. Well, and that involves presenting a position in the worst possible light.
Tony Esolen wrote an excellent article in the most recent Touchstone called "Maleficent Obsession,"
right.
That we'll link to as well. Which,
right, it's a terrible. It's a terrible. When it comes down to it, you can't. There's just a fundamental everything. It seems to me everything that Martin Luther King worked for is being reversed because we have resegregation.
So we could say, just to sort of put maybe a poetic end to this.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King Jr. is a liberation theologian in the vein of Gutierrez.
Yeah, I think so. Although, in the sense that he wanted to change it was critical reflection on contemporary American praxis in the light of certainly the normative sources of the faith, but certainly also the normative sources of our culture, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States,
right?
The choices and that men like Lincoln and others made throughout the centuries. So that the idea that somehow nothing has changed, that there's no criticism. Yes, you have to consider the fact that, yes, of course, men have made slavery, the practice of slavery. Men made bad choices. They had a bad understanding of human beings, and so on and so on. But there's the dynamic of history, the dynamic of that assertion, that universally valid truth that all men are created equal, continued to unfold. Again, the promissory note says. Now, of course, as I said, nothing. It doesn't mean that no more than Gutierrez was. Free of criticism, of course not.
Sure, and of course, there's a lot of things in
exactly.
We wouldn't agree with.
You could criticize, John Paul II, Centesimus Annus, his discussion of capitalism being a free market system being embedded in a tripartite structure of economic liberty, moral virtue, biblical religion, all of that. Gutierrez, treated capitalism as a kind of crony capitalism.
Yeah.
Treated capitalism
capitalism is just, it's changed. It has morphed itself, right? I mean, it's not the capitalism of 1930s and 40s.
The free market system, this is where, as opposed to what we now see all around us, this idea among the Democrats, this idea of a planned economy, a central economy, because that to me is what socialism is the ascribing, thinking that the economy is a planned economy, and it's being that the engine of prosperity is the state, as opposed to thinking that human enterprise. My wife and I, when we were in Florida, we went to the Edison Ford Winter Estates, and we've watched this documentary on Edison. I mean, he was an entrepreneur, he was creative, he was imaginative, he was a worker. I bought my wife this shirt that says, invention is 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration.
Perspiration, right?
Right. It's all about work. It's all about creativity, and because the engine of prosperity is going to be people, not the state. The state, throwing trillions of dollars into the culture, into the economy, is not what's going to get the culture back, continuing back on its feet, and so on.
Well, it's interesting too, and I haven't got into Reinhold Niebuhr's book yet. I just read the introductions, but the idea being that, if it is the larger the structure, the greater the evil, the potential for evil.
Right.
Then it seems what you'd want to do is limit large structures in what they can do, right? Which is the whole conservative impulse, is that, you don't want your superstructures to have that much influence and control. You want to limit them
that's where anti-totalitarian, that's the whole point of the subsidiarity principle and sphere sovereignty and
subsidiarity, exactly.
The subsidiarity.
We talked about last time a little bit as well. Yeah. Well, this has been great. So I think we have shown, though, that at least we've definitely distinguished between liberation theology and liberal theology.
Yes, I think there's
as well as shown that liberation theology doesn't necessarily have anything to do with critical theories. And certainly
only insofar as that statement from Marx that philosophers have up to now been busy interpreting the world, but the idea is to change it.
Right.
And of course, they think you can learn from Marx and class struggle. So that remember, that's in the document from the CDF. That was one of the problematic aspects.
And one would have to be careful, as the church was, Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant. There you would have to be, of course, careful.
The dynamic of history. Marx in the Communist Manifesto, as it opens, the dynamic of history for him is the class struggle. But I don't think that.
I think we might say too, because Christianity's true, right, and our dogmas are true, like the dogma of original sin.
Right.
Our tendency would be to want to pretend as if there was no original sin.
Right.
That is infecting the individual and the societies that the individual.
So that's where you have the approach that only looks at social,
right,
structural sin, as opposed to the responsibility that we have for sin itself, personal sin. And so then the idea that Christ came to redeem us from our sin, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting men's sins against them, and all of that. Yeah. And that may have all kinds of implications for the culture and how you engage the culture. Yeah. But primarily, it's about being reconciled to God.
Yeah.
Reconciliation reconciled to God
has to come first, in a sense, right? Exactly. What are you going to do otherwise, except if go forth and create more corrupt institutions?
Right. Now that's compatible, of course, with the lordship of Christ and the transformation of the culture, et cetera, et cetera. But at its core is the idea that we've been we need to be reconciled to God. St. Paul says, as you know, in 2 Corinthians 5, the message that we're ambassadors of is be reconciled to God.
Right.
And that's what, because sin separates us from God, the cross of Jesus, the resurrection of Christ is what, we're now a new creation. Sin is, at its core, is abrogated, the impact of sin, and so on. All of that seems to me, if you have a purely this worldly gospel, you don't understand.
Right.
You don't. It's like this guy, the guy who unfortunately won the Senate seat in Georgia, and
Warnock.
Warnock, and then made these comments about how the resurrection of Christ, that's transcended by helping other people, and so on and so on.
Right.
So he doesn't really understand that. What's that?
It reverses the order.
It reverses the order, exactly. So all of that is unfortunate, but it just shows you this.
And of course, I think at the spiritual level, the danger here is something like if churches, if churches continue to teach, preach, advocate for a merely immanent gospel, social gospel,
right?
We're malleable people. We are malleable people, and we are susceptible to our cultural winds and waves and tides.
Right.
And the spiritual practices start to diminish, and our empowerment by the Holy Spirit.
There is spiritual warfare, and the dynamics of culture is not economics. It may affect our economic systems. No one can claim that the free market system. The free market system has led to the commodification of all the goods of life. And so consumerism.
Yeah.
So we'd want to reject making human beings just consumers,
which is
which is fine, and so you can turn that into an idol, and so on.
Right.
But on the other hand, we still have to take seriously the free market system, economic liberty.
Yep.
The Acton Institute, economic liberty is at the core of the democratic enterprise. Economic liberty has a virtue, because you have to make wise choices, and the surest anchor of virtue.
Speech,
right?
Which we could talk about another time, but it's also brought up by my colleague Logan that has an inherent value.
Well, of course,
obviously,
absolutely.
but
that's being denied.
It's being denied. Yeah,
that's being denied. It's interesting how someone like Francis Schaeffer understood this way back. Not only Escape from Reason, but in his book, The Church at the End of the 20th Century, he discusses the loss of freedom of speech at the in Berkeley, California. Anyway,
all good.
Good to see you.
Trying times. Thank you again, Ed, for doing this for us.